Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is Glenn Ricci and I am a historical archaeologist. I'm working at the Landesmuseum Natur und Mensch in Oldenburg. That's near Bremen. The exhibition I'm working on is following a theme of Eigen und Fremd, or familiar and foreign. It is a cross-cultural comparison from the ethnological collection and will be presented 26th of September 2014 through the 12th of April 2015 for those of you who are in the area. Some of you may be asking yourself, why is an archaeologist working with an ethnology collection? So before I explain the exhibit any further, I'd like to take a moment to explain what archaeology is and how a historical archaeologist works. The public has an idea of what archaeology is, and most of it comes from popular movies and video games, and some of it's just plain wrong. So, what is archaeology? In America, archaeology developed as a subfield of anthropology, which is a holistic study of mankind. The other subfields of anthropology are physical anthropology, which looks at human osteology or the study of bones, linguistic or cognitive anthropology that looks at how humans speak and think, and cultural anthropology, which is also referred to as ethnology and is the study of present-day living cultures. Archaeology, then, is the holistic study of mankind through material remains. Material remains could be bits of garbage, or intricate vessels, human bones, ritual objects, and common everyday objects such as these bits of clay smoking pipe. To clear up some common misconceptions about archaeology, let me say that for material to have archaeological significance, it does not need to be buried, it does not need to be ancient, and does not need to be of a foreign culture. For example, the first work I did in Germany was buildings archaeology, looking at a 19th century Leichenhalle in Berlin, and looking at how it changed over time while controlled by various governments. Within archaeology, there are two subfields, prehistoric and historical. Most people know the prehistoric as it deals with the distant past, and the cultures that are examined do not have a written record. So basically we're talking about Stone Age civilizations and such. Historical, on the other hand, deals with cultures much more recent. These cultures have a written record, they've been written about by other cultures, such as when the Spanish conquered the Inca in the 16th century, or the cultures have oral histories, such as those of the First Nation people in America. And it also deals with much more modern civilizations, such as our own. Now that we have a basic understanding of what historical archaeology is, let's take a look at the ethnology collection in the Landesmuseum. There are approximately 7,000 objects from around the world and from cultures during various time periods. But what exactly is in the ethnology collection? Well, some object examples that demonstrate the variety of time and geographical regions covered are these Peruvian vessels dating from 100 BC to about 1532 AD, a mummified head from Egypt, 200 BC to 200 AD, a necklace of human teeth from Samoa collected sometime in the 20th century, many spears from German East Africa collected between 1886 and 1898, and some First Nation objects from 1843 to 1950 AD. We also have items from China, Japan, Brazil, Papua New Guinea, India, and other countries. This is a wide-ranging collection from very different cultures, so you may be asking yourself, but how does a historical archaeologist analyze an ethnographic collection? Well, basically I'm looking for the context of an item in a culture, which tends to give the object more significance than those objects without a context. Let's look at an example of an object. Take this beer bottle, for example. Typically, the documentation provides no context for an item. So now what can we say about this bottle? We could look at the manufacturing technique, dip mold, and say this technique was common through the 18th and 19th century. The model of the bottle was common for beer and ale, so we can say a bit about the diet of the culture, but really, without a proper context, we can't say so much about this bottle. So let's take that same bottle and say it was documented that it was found upside down on the east coast of America. And inside of this bottle were 6 pins, a pottery shard, and a bird bone. Take this contextual information and pair it with the historical record or the ethno-historic accounts, and we can say a lot more about this bottle. Right now we can tell that it would probably be a witch bottle, the earliest ever found being in England. This shows a cultural transmission between the Old and New World. Furthermore, the ethno-historic record tells us this bottle would have been placed upside down near where the suspected witch would have lived or walked, and was supposed to cast the curse back onto them. We also know that this curse was usually in the form of urinary infection. The historical record is full of people using urine to get back at witches, and it is likely that this would have also been filled with urine, with the needles being present to symbolize the pain of the cursed. The historical records are full of interesting ways to get back at witches, whether urinating in bottles or baking urine in cake. The point is that the bottle has much more cultural significance when it is examined in its context and in conjunction with the written record. Of course, we usually don't have such a specific context. So let's take that same bottle and put it into a new context. Let's say that it was found in Africa, not this Africa, but this Africa, German East Africa of the late 19th century. Now, most, if any at all, of the indigenous people of German East Africa left no written record, but that doesn't mean that they were invisible in the written record. The early German explorers documented, albeit with varying degrees of accuracy or objectivity, the people they encountered. And there are even instances of how a common beer bottle would have been used among certain tribes. Of course, one needs to be careful in using these ethno-historic accounts. Certain questions need to be considered, such as, did the author have an agenda? For example, was it racist or ethnocentric for political reasons, so that, for example, the Spanish could enslave the Inca? More importantly, was the author actually there? Or were they just recording hearsay? To check this, are there any corroborative sources for what this author is reporting? If the author is the only one, then it's a little suspicious. Now, the same process can also be applied to human remains. Physical anthropology is one of my specialties, so we'll look at a quick example. What can be learned from human remains? Ideally, we can learn physical traits, habitual activities such as right or left-handedness or frequent horseback riding, diet, status, medical knowledge, for example, did the person have healed bones, filled or fake teeth, was surgery performed? We can learn a bit about social structure and practices in warfare, such as are there signs of execution, weapon marks, etc. Take the mummified head as an example. The only documented information available was the inventory number and that it was from Egypt. The physical anthropology suggests that the person died between 35 and 50 years of age and was male. Without x-rays or CAT scans, not too much can be said without seeing the actual bones. But still, by examining the head as we would the beer bottle, we obtain a wealth of new information. We can get an approximate time of burial, the status of the individual, the cost of his burial even, religious affiliation, which was indicated by the gilded skin that is still present, and even the strong influence the Egyptians had over their conquerors and the burial practices of the social elites. Basically, what I'm trying to do with the ethnographic collection is provide a deeper understanding of the cultures that created the objects. Other areas that are expanded on in my research are the history of the cultures, locating comparative examples, looking at manufacturing techniques, trade with other cultures, influences these cultures had on one another, and so on. So now that you have a bit of an idea of how I'm working with the collection, it is worth noting when items were donated to the museum. 5% of the collection comes from the pre-colonial period, 48% from the colonial period, and during both of these collecting phases, the objects were generally taken from the contemporaneous populations. And 47% was collected from the post-colonial period. In this 47%, there is a lot of jewelry from North Africa, but a significant number of objects are from pre-Columbian Peru and Chile. In other words, a significant amount of the post-colonial collecting was not of contemporaneous populations, but from an archaeological context. And the ethnology collecting in general, while collected from contemporaneous peoples at the time, is an ethno-historical and archaeological collection of objects. Now, in order to link the present-day visitor to the objects of a different culture from a distant time and place, a universal theme was chosen. What is a universal theme? Well, think about what humans have in common. We are born, we eat, to be alive there has to be sex, we interact with our environment, whether hunting or farming, everyone dies at one point, building shelter or some form of protection from the elements. These are just some examples of what can generally be considered human universals. But since the ethnology collection was so spread out over time and over the world, I needed a theme that tied all of these together in some way, and for that reason I chose to look at religion in general. Religion will be defined as beliefs and behaviors that involve supernatural beings, powers, and/or forces. I know this is a broad definition and can include aspects of Western culture that we would not consider religion. For example, think Lucky Rabbit's Foot, or think good luck charms for sports teams. Nonetheless, religion will be used for a lack of a better term, and it is easier than saying belief system every time. An exact definition of religion has not been agreed upon by anthropologists, and this has been a topic for centuries. One I do not expect to answer, nor a definition I expect everyone to be happy with. Anthropologically speaking, these beliefs are difficult to separate from this, or even this, or even this. The problem of definition arises from the lack of natural world differences that these beliefs actually create. In other words, beliefs in all of these will be treated equally. Through religion, we can examine the foreign and the familiar. The hope is that the visitor will be able to relate or find parallels with other cultures, or at the very least to understand the differences. Based on the ethnology collection, certain themes within religion were chosen. I would like to examine different cultures' creation mythology, rites of passage, such as circumcision, an act not only found in the Old Testament, to look at different kinds of objects being worshipped, from figures to sacred blades, to the taboos regarding having certain items worshipped. I would also like to look at certain tobacco rituals. This may seem a bit out of place, but we'll look at the use of tobacco in the Americas, where it was generally linked to the supernatural world, and also compare this to the post-1492 period when tobacco was being introduced to the rest of the world, such as Africa. Questions that will be asked is, how do these people use the sacred plant, and how did it affect their belief system? For example, there were some Muslims that claim Muhammad forbid the use of tobacco, despite that it would not be discovered for another 10 centuries. While in the Philippines there are local tales of times long ago that have also incorporated tobacco into their mythological stories, even though tobacco was introduced by the Spanish in the 16th century. Sacrifice is also a common theme found, especially human sacrifice. Who could hold a feast and when, and how the food should be treated will also be examined. This wood milk pail is common in East Africa and reflects the taboo about milk touching metal. Among the Maasai, this was their sacred milk. Also, the resistance of too much or relying on the charity of others to survive will also be examined, along with the animals that were sacred or unclean, along with other dietary taboos that cultures have. We'll look at body modification in the name of religion. Again, there is circumcision, but also elongated skulls found around the globe. The most famous, arguably, are the Peruvian skulls. There are also the piercing of the ears that only certain castes could perform because they were the chosen people. For example, the Maasai and the Inca. Then there is afterlife mythology, such as hell and heaven, but also about how people are to be judged before they go to the other side. Once a person is dead, society keeps going. How is the body treated? Now, some of these examples may seem extremely difficult to understand to a European, such as being cremated and then wrapped in a leaf kept for rituals, or say having your skull covered in clay and shell for display. But even these examples are easily related to modern German culture. How? Well, I hope that by showing similar treatment, such as the decorated skull of St. Benedictus in the Church of St. Michael in Munich, that certain practices are not so different from what we see today. This skull, by the way, is not an isolated instance of decorating Holy Skull in Germany. There are many, many more. And as far as the bits of bone collected for rituals, one needs to look no further than all the reliquaries in Europe that supposedly contain the bones of saints and other holy people. Then we'll look at life after death. Well, not exactly life after death for the deceased, but more what was life like for the people after death. Were grave goods being brought, family burials, remembering the dead, consulting the dead, such as what the Inca frequently did to their mummy bundles. And we'll also take a look at more modern aspects of life after death, such as looting, tomb raiding, and naturally archaeology, such as how did these objects end up in Oldenburg in the first place. Now, I must address the obvious foreseeable problem with showing a cross-cultural comparison of religious practices. The main potential problem is that some people believe, that is to say, they might be offended. But this is a museum of nature and mankind, and I do not expect that the natural history will be altered because some people believe the Earth is only 6,000 years old, such as certain Christian creationists. Likewise, some people believe the Earth is billions and billions of years old, such as certain Hindus. The bottom line is that some people might be offended, but that is obviously not the intention of the exhibit. The goal of the exhibit is to allow visitors to cross-culturally compare what are typically considered Western beliefs with those of other cultures represented in the ethnology collection. I want to take something that is seemingly foreign and make it familiar. Let's look at an example of something familiar. Here are some examples of the Nazca practice of ritual collecting of heads. This was performed for a variety of reasons: sacrifice, agriculture, collected as trophies for deities. But how do we take something like this and make it familiar? Maybe not personally familiar to the visitor, but culturally familiar. We can look at the decapitation of Goliath by the hero David in the Old Testament, or the fate of John the Baptist in the New Testament, or Judith's action in the book of Judith. The amount of artwork devoted to these scenes alone, compared to the amount of decapitations found on Nazca pottery, is certainly an interesting cultural similarity. One might dismiss the similarity as the European context being simply artwork, while the Nazca collected actual heads. But the obsession with heads does not end with artwork. Take the head of John the Baptist, for example. Everyone wants the real head, including Germany. In Munich, there is a finely decorated skull on display. We can certainly say that this skull, whosever it may actually be, has been elevated to a holy or sacred status that people have come to venerate and worship. At any rate, it's a place of pilgrimage now. I hope that the visitor will take their familiar present-day culture and be able to relate it to a foreign culture. And with that being said, the exhibit must be selective of what beliefs can be shown. Not every belief or every aspect of each belief can be covered. It may seem that I'm cherry-picking examples, but I'm working with what is present in the ethnology collection, which tended to be items of curiosity. That being said, let's look at the exhibition space, which will take place in the gallery. That is here, here, and here. Space is enough to allow vitrines to stand on either side of the aisle without being too narrow. But on one side, there will only be allowed to have one vitrine, that is to allow it to still be handicap accessible. The gallery will provide a structured beginning and end for the visitor to walk through, preferably from creation to life after death. This not only takes the visitor from birth through death, but also from the mythical distant past of creation to the present day by looking at how some of these burial goods arrived here. You can see from these sample vitrines, there will be a limit of what can be shown. Therefore, select objects will have to act as visual aids for larger cultural practices. For example, A single patent could be used to discuss not only the social practice of Holy Communion, but also discuss the Last Supper. Another problem using the ethnology collection to analyze the familiar is that the familiar objects were not typically collected. Remember the beer bottle? Who would collect that? This also means that rarely any European objects were collected, especially religious ones. To rectify this and save space in the gallery, a poor man's Bible approach will be used. This is to say, images of religious scenes will be used to illustrate stories and practices. Also, when possible, photographs will be used to help put objects in their cultural context. Hopefully this will help free up space in the gallery while also being visually stimulating. The museum also has a variety of animals that were collected. If possible, I would also like to incorporate certain animals into the exhibit. The interaction of humans with the animals was especially influential in creation mythology, such as the rainbow serpent of Australian Aboriginals or the talking serpent of the Old Testament. This pairing of the natural world with the supernatural world works well with the material culture that was produced. For example, some indigenous Australians view the boomerang as a representation of the rainbow serpent. At this point, we're still in the planning and research phase, figuring out which themes can maybe be cut shorter or expanded on, and as we go through the ethnology collection, maybe certain things can be added that we didn't think of before. Hopefully you have an idea now of what the exhibit Eigen Fremd is all about. I'd like to thank you for your time, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks again.